Okay. All right. So
Okay,
thank you so much, Ben, for joining me in this project. I'm super excited to talk to you. This is for the Oral History Project and Omeka S Digital Archive site, How We Remember, where I speak to Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars about Indigenous history, topics, related subjects, anything of that sort of interest. So to really get started, would you mind stating your name, age, and your current occupation?
sure. My name is Ben Leeming, and as of uh, 2024, I'm 53 years old, and I, for 27 or 28 years now, been a member of the history faculty at the Rivers School in Weston, Massachusetts.
Hey, that's awesome. And once again, thank you for participating. Could you also tell me a little bit about your background and where you grew up?
I'm a Massachusetts native. I grew up in the Boston area. I've lived here my whole life. I'm a New Englander through and through, and went to school here at Tufts University undergrad. Did some master's work at Harvard University. Um, had a short trip outside of New England,
Mhm.
immediate New England, doing PhD studies at the University at Albany, one of the SUNY schools. And I live just outside of Boston in one of the suburbs. And as I said, I've been here my whole life.
Yeah, yep. Tried and true New Englander. I'm guessing you probably have
Indeed,
opinions
indeed.
on clam chowder and all that, but
Sure, sure, and all kinds of things like that.
yes.
Absolutely.
And then before getting into any research questions, sort of the last sort of fun fact question or personal question is there anything a fun fact or interesting about you that you'd want to share? And it doesn't have to be relevant to your research.
Sure. Well, it's hard not to make things relevant to my research. This is kind of tangentially related, I guess. I've always been absolutely fascinated in history, especially England. My interest in colonial Mexico goes back about 20 years now, to when I was doing graduate work at Harvard. But not only have I lived my whole life in Massachusetts, I have nine different family my mother's and my father's side, whose history in New England goes all the way back to the 17th century, and a few of them to the so-called Puritan Great Migration of the 1630s or so. And those roots are they mean something to me. They come with a very complex history that is not without its blemishes. I'm sure I haven't researched my family history terribly extensively. It's kind of a new project for me, and I'm finding it a very interesting process. In I devote my independent scholarship to, and I'm trying to really remain open about understanding my own past and my positionality in terms of that past, as a historian and as a teacher and just as a citizen. So yeah, fun has been around for quite a long time in this part of the world.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's one really cool that you can trace all the way back to that point. And I think
Yeah,
it's also
yeah.
really neat to be able to do a family genealogy. And out of curiosity, are there like local archives that you've been consulting to do that, or has it been something like Ancestry?
Yeah. Yeah, it's mostly that. And my mother has done quite a lot of genealogical research, so she's done quite a bit. I'm in terms of my own investigation of that, I'm kind of just starting, and so no, have a lot of that kind of yet.
Forthcoming. That'll be exciting.
Yes, forthcoming.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, transitioning into some of the research questions I had for you, I know you already briefly stated your education, your work experience. I know you are currently the chair of history at the Rivers School in Weston. Would you mind just talking a little bit more about sort of your journey to where you are now, some
Mm,
of your majors, if at any point you changed your mind, anything like that?
yeah, yeah. It's kind of a long circuitous path. I mean, I kind of stumbled into education as a ended up falling in love with both teaching and being in the classroom with high school age students. And it that is something that from a very, very early moment in my career, I knew that that's a lot of joy, and I found it a really truly wonderful career. And the River School, it I've stayed there for all of this time because it's a truly remarkable community of really passionate and wonderful colleagues, and the kids are great, and the program my career, I majored in art history at Tufts University. So I came into Rivers teaching art history for a sabbatical fill-in for 1 year, and then when that person returned from their sabbatical, I sort of transitioned into teaching in the history department, and I realized really quickly that although my art history background gave me some grounding in history. It was primarily Western history, and I really felt the need for more education in straight history. And so, an master's program through Harvard's Extension School, which is part of their division of continuing education, and it was one of the few programs that I could find in the Boston area that allowed me to pursue master's studies on a part-time basis, allowing me to keep my job and continue and chip away at my master's degree over a number of years. I think it was 6 or 7 years. During those years, I happened to take a course. I think it was in 2002 or 2003. And I think it was titled Mesoamerican Civilizations, and it was taught by the Harvard Archbishop with his good friend and historian of religions, David Carrasco. And that sort of dynamic duo, they're extremely charismatic personalities, and I fell under their sway, and I became enchanted with region and time period in history, became very interested in that. And because I've always been interested in colonial history, it was particularly the contact period that really grabbed my attention. To me, it was so fascinating to kind of observe and to study two civilizations completely separate from each other came together, and what happened in that kind of deeply contested and violent and tumultuous interaction. And as someone who has also always been curious about the history of religion in particular, I was particularly enchanted and interested in how the Roman Catholic Church, through its missionaries, sought to engage with indigenous language and religion to try to translate Christianity for indigenous American audiences. And in some sort of process, I think it was David Carrasco who talked about the Nahuatl language, which prior to the Spanish invasion had been the kind of lingua franca of the Aztec Empire, and was a language that was spoken all over Mesoamerica, in Aztecs or Mexica. And that when the Aztec Empire was toppled, the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church both decided to use Nahuatl as one of their primary languages, both for civic affairs, but also and indoctrination. And I learned that this language, which I had really honestly never heard of before or never thought about, had resulted, because it was adopted by the church and the state, it resulted in a massive documentary corpus of writing and many, many different genres in this language, and frankly in other indigenous languages. And it really struck me as a fascinating thing that there was this time period which has been so well studied for 500 years, and yet the story has been told almost exclusively from Spanish, and yet there exists this corpus of this documentary corpus in indigenous languages that was just beginning to be studied by scholars through translation and analysis and publication. And it was really beginning to retell that whole period and to add many indigenous voices into our understanding of that time period. It's really had a profound impact on the historiography of the contact period in Mesoamerica. So just as out of curiosity, I online began to study Nahuatl in my free time, and I very, very quickly discovered um, an absolute passion
Mhm.
for this beautiful language, which is so different, was so different, and is so different than was a, fell down that rabbit hole and really went deep. And I spent a number of years just kind of picking away um, on my own. Learning the language and exploring some of this colonial documentation, and eventually scholars who were actively using the language in their research and publication. I connected with a couple in particular who took me under their wing and acted as kind of informal tutors. And then in 2009, I decided that I was going to, and I enrolled in a 2-month intensive summer language program in Zacatecas, Mexico, which is continues to be hosted by the Instituto de Docencia e Investigación Etnológica de Zacatecas, or IDI Mexico, but it is also has affiliates in the United States of America. And I spent 2 months learning in a classroom from instructors, which included indigenous tutors who were there to help me try to understand the of Nahuatl, their home region of the Huasteca of Veracruz. Um, And it was by the end of that summer that I had decided that I was going to pursue PhD studies because I really was determined to hone my language skills and to gain the education and the to write and publish my own work, analyzing these remarkable sources. So in 2010, I began PhD studies. I had sought out the direction of one scholar in particular who I had over the past few become of her work. Her name is Louise Burkhart, and she is really the foremost authority on this kind of intercultural dialogue between mendicant missionaries and indigenous people in this early colonial. Written some very important works, that are really touchstones in this field. So I really wanted to study with her, and I was very fortunate that she was A, close by, or relatively close by in Albany, and B, she was willing to take me on as a somewhat non-traditional graduate student at age 40. Um, years later, I completed my PhD and have been actively working as an independent scholar since then, in addition to, of course, teaching at the River
Right.
School. So that's in a kind of broad brushstrokes. That's
And I think I just wanted to comment and say that I think it's amazing that obviously not only are you so clearly passionate about the subject, but also having the fortitude to keep going with the subject and the language learning and the community over
yeah,
such a long span of time. And I think that's
right.
just something I think is really great. Is that you really have to love something
Well,
to pursue it that diligently for that amount of time.
yeah,
And I just think
yeah.
that's so great.
I tell my wife that it's helped me avoid a midlife crisis. It gave,
Yeah.
this gave me some real direction and purpose, and it is it. I hope it's clear that that my approach to this is, although it began in a kind of a informal and I began as an autodidact, this is in no way a hobby for
Mhm.
me. I take this extremely seriously, and although I have an kind of institutional affiliation in that, I'm not associated or employed by Institute of Higher Learning. Um, you know, this is something that is very much at the heart of my professional being, and I continue to learn and to grow, and do this work, and hopefully have an impact on others by making these sources available.
And I think, how you emphasize taking it serious and it being the core of, who you are and what you do, I
Yeah.
think really represents, how much you care about, sort of turning the historical narrative on its head, seeing the Indigenous
Mhm.
voices in the history and everything
Mhm.
that has sort of been off balance. So I just think that
Right,
is a
right.
really interesting sort of discussion. And sort of on that note, then, just to talk a little bit about your recently published book from 2 years ago, Aztec Antichrist Performing the Apocalypse in Early Colonial Mexico. I know it touches upon indigenous Christianities as well as a bunch of other themes.
Right.
And I know it's
Right.
impossible to summarize an entire book in one interview.
Yes.
So if you just want to be able to give, sort of a broader summary or what some of these Christianities look like, that would be
Sure.
great.
Sure. Yeah. This is a story I love to tell. And for anybody who may be listening to this, um, I narrate this story in the prologue to the book, which is a short introduction to how I came to write this particular book. But in a nutshell, in 2014, I was doing research for my I I wanted to find some materials that either had never been um, examined, studied, published, and or only lightly so. And so I was kind of making the rounds of various archives and collections. Um, pretty resources were limited. I don't have a lot of funding for. I didn't have a lot of funding for my graduate work, so I was kind of driving myself all over the place. But anyway, I had made the journey to the Upper West Side of New York to the Hispanic Society of America, where that there were some interesting colonial Nahuatl materials, and I ended up finding buried in a thick notebook of miscellaneous Christian texts that had been copied into this notebook by an indigenous person sometime in the mid to late 16th century. I ended up finding two very early religious plays, scripts for religious plays, and religious theater in the 16th century was one of the most popular forms of or medium for indoctrination by the Catholic Church. The Catholic friars had introduced medieval morality plays and passion plays and other kinds of religious theater into their sort of toolkit or their repertoire for teaching indigenous people about Christianity. And unlike some of their of of teaching like sermons and going to mass and saying the catechism, which Native people really didn't like that much. They really embraced theater, and there's all kinds of interesting thoughts on why that might have been so. But the fact of the matter, middle years of the 16th century or the end of the 16th century for sure, many, if not most, indigenous communities had adopted their own passion plays or epiphany plays or other kinds of religious theater that had really become a sort of central social and cultural practice in their lives. And this is one of the most important ways that Christianity not only became kind of rooted in indigenous communities, but it was one of the vectors through which Native people reinterpreted and appropriated Christianity,
Mhm.
resulting in this or multiplication of what I and others refer to as Christianities. And what I mean by that is that rather than thinking of just one kind of global or monolithic native Christianity that encompasses all different forms of practices, what we find adapted Christianity to their local uh, their local tastes, and so how Christianity was practiced in this pueblo might look somewhat different from how it was practiced in other pueblos. And the text production by indigenous people in indigenous languages, and I should reiterate that all of
Mhm.
this religious theater is being done in indigenous languages
Mhm.
by native peoples for native audiences. That these texts were one of the primary ways native people kind of their own. It's one of the things that I find most interesting about this particular area of study. But anyway, I found these two plays, and they had a very interesting and juicy subject matter. It was the medieval legend of the Antichrist and the end of the
Mhm.
world and the final judgment, and they're just absolutely stories, which are acted by a host of 20 or 30 characters. And It was such a fascinating find. My advisor, Louise Burkhardt, had actually just a couple of years before finished publishing with her colleague, Barry Sell, and others volumes of all of the known or most of the known colonial Nahuatl theater texts. It's a relatively small but important genre of colonial religious documentation. There's about 30 to 40 of these scripts that survive. And she had no idea of these Antichrist. It's really, I don't know, it's quite fortuitous that I was able to find them and write about them. So now we have two more.
Yeah.
So the book is contains the full transcription of two scripts as a number of chapters of analysis. And um, yeah, that's hard to believe that that project began in 2014, and by 2022 it was out in a book, and now I'm just enjoying kind of talking about it as even as other projects.
Yes. Yeah, no, and I think it's great that you managed to find two that were not like previously known about. I mean, that's a huge, I feel like that's a huge
I was
accomplishment.
really lucky. It was a really quite the luck of the draw. Although I will say one of the greatest I about gaining facility with indigenous languages of Mesoamerica is that there is this documentary corpus that is so little known, and one of the reasons it's little known is that not enough uh, skills to kind of
Mhm.
decide or to determine what these documents are and what they say and what their significance is. I should say there aren't enough people outside of indigenous communities. In fact,
Mhm.
none of these languages, or very few of these languages, are dead. Nahuatl is
Mhm.
the largest indigenous language spoken in Mexico. Today, there's like 1.5 to 2 million native speakers. The sad reality is that many of them, most of them perhaps, don't really know that this documentary corpus exists.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I'm is finding ways to connect with indigenous scholars and
Mhm.
indigenous people to share some of these remarkable frankly, works of literature, some of the earliest works of indigenous American literature that come from the 16th, 17th centuries. Um, so yes, having more people who are learning these indigenous languages and being able to contribute to this exciting work of recovery is really necessary.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think that sort of tied into my next question for you, which was about studying the language itself. I know
Mhm.
you've studied this for almost 20 years now.
Yeah,
So we've
yeah.
already discussed sort of what drew you to the language. Can you describe what the learning experience itself was like? Were there any
Mhm.
challenges, or did it come to you easier than you
Mhm.
expected?
Oh
Things
yeah.
like that.
Oh no, this is for those of us whose native languages is English or any other Romance language or even Indo-European language. Well, I'll stick to Romance languages. Nahuatl it seems to speakers of English to be very complex and difficult to understand how the syntax works and things like that. In terms of how to learn it, there's a kind of a normal path and then there's my path. I mean, the normal path, this language non-native people is by taking classes like the EDS Summer Institute, which is still offered at the University of Utah, where one can gain extensive classroom experience, with the language. So it also offers courses during the semester, so one can advance from beginning to intermediate to advanced, both in the colonial variant of Nahuatl and the modern variant spoken in the Huasteca region. So the normal path of learning the language is just a lot of classroom work, and for some people, actually traveling to parts of Mexico where the language is still spoken and engaging in projects there to engage with native speakers and to try to learn further. It used to be that programs would kind of into a native community and spend a week kind of observing and trying their language skills out by interacting with them. But I'm really happy to learn that that's evolving and becoming more of a reciprocal kind of relationship. And in the past, I think for some people, it felt a little exploitative, a little bit like these sort of people were coming in and sort of taking from us and not really giving much in return. And I know that in certain circumstances now, with the leadership of Indigenous scholars, uh, people like me who go into these communities are actually doing things like teaching English classes to give back to the community, and in exchange kind of hearing and learning and engaging with people speaking the language in a sort of in that kind of immersive way. So way to learn it, ways to do that. By the way, I mean, there are ways to learn many of the various Mayan languages like Quiche or Cachiquel or Tzotzil. You can take Zapotec courses. There's courses in other languages as well. And I'll have really interesting documentary corpora as well, which need to be interpreted. Nahuatl has the largest of the documentary corpora, but yeah, there's lots of them out there.
Yeah, and I'd love
So
to
for
check
me,
those out.
I learned it. You should. And for me, as I've already said, I began as an autodidact and then worked with some tutors and then did the formal, intensive program in the summer. And then really after that, it was just a lot of hard work, just kind of like anything else, practice, practice, practice. And
Absolutely. And I know you were talking about how things have sort of changed a bit. You go in, or these programs go into places and they're a little more, reciprocal, not just, extracting and leaving, or somebody isn't
right.
compensated. So specifically, you talked about teaching English classes. What are some other ways you built a relationship with the communities you work with? And you probably have worked with several, but what and where
Sure.
were these communities?
Well, so to be clear, I have not taught English classes. I've never journeyed to
Mm,
an indigenous part.
mhm,
Be due to personal and family reasons.
mm,
I really haven't done a lot of traveling, and
mhm,
that is something that I see as that can be seen as a handicap. I do think it's very important for people who are working with these materials and working as historians in this area to have relationships with people who are from these areas. I have sought out and maintained relationships with Mexican scholars
mm,
and indigenous scholars. Uh, the conference. So we have those of us who are engaged in scholarship relating to Nahuatl people and the Nahuatl language. We have a professional association called the Association of Nahuatl Scholars.
mm,
We've met every year since 2008. It's a small annual conference. It's a very diverse group of folks that include people from Europe and from Mexico, from the US, native people, non-native people, and it's a very fruitful kind of interchange that takes place every year at these meetings. And so I have developed relationships through that. But it's it's something that's complicated, and I alluded earlier to my positionality as a New Englander, as someone who is a descendant of colonists myself, someone who is very aware of the trauma that colonialism has on communities both here in New England and all over the Americas. My positionality as a white scholar, an academic, working with indigenous language materials, I have really just tried to be open, hearing other people thoughts about how I fit into the conversation. I've tried to remain respectful and open about my sources, and to pursue relationships with people who can help me gain insight. Might on and I do hope that my work brings honor to indigenous communities. Um, and again, this is kind of relevant to personal and family reasons, which I choose not to go into at this particular time, but I've my ability to kind of leave New England, but
Mhm.
I'm entering into kind of a stage of my life where I'm hoping to be able to do some more traveling and get out a little bit more. Um, but I guess just to kind of tie this thread up, I try to accept that I have much to learn, even as I am trying to use the skills I have acquired
Mhm.
to spread knowledge about a particular time in history and a particular people who have tended to be left out of the conversation.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I hope that I can do to to correct that.
And I think, what I sort of like that you brought up is that I think traveling isn't always accessible to everyone. And I think especially non-traditional scholars or
Mhm.
people returning or for any other sort of reason. And I really like that you talk
Right.
about how there are different ways to go about building connections, whether it's with other scholars or through
Mhm.
associations and meetings and doing the work
Right.
itself.
Right.
I think that's also a really good reminder for anybody that will watch this of, if you're thinking,
Mhm.
oh, I can't fly out of the country, you don't necessarily have to
Right.
still be doing really something important and making those connections. So thank you for
Right.
sharing that. Um, and
Sure.
then I think the next question I had, and so probably your book might be the answer. I was going to ask,
Uh-huh.
what are some key projects or moments that stand out in your memory or were really important to you, um, besides the book, or is the probably the book is the main one. I know if that was me, I'd be like, yeah, the book.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, that's certainly important, but definitely not the most important thing. I think for me, the most important thing has been the relationships that I've developed with people over the years, and the connections I've made with other scholars and people who are interested in these subjects, whether that be through conferences or through small groups, whether it be through language classes or just people I meet online. It's definitely the relationships have been really the touchstone for me. And what I find most rewarding about all of this is sharing what I'm doing and what I'm finding and hearing what they're doing and what they're finding as well. So those kinds of interactions and relationships are really forefront for sure.
Mhm.
If I had to mention a couple other things, I guess I would say that in 2021, I was awarded fellowship for a year of full-time work on my next project, which I was very honored and excited to receive. And so I was on leave from teaching in 2021, 2022, and I worked on completing a an English very, very important collection of missionary writing. It's a collection of sermons that were composed under the direction of the eminent Franciscan friar Bernardino de
Mhm.
Sahagún, who most people who are familiar with early colonial Mexican history will associate with Codex,
Mhm.
the best known primary source from early colonial Mexico. Sahagún in the late 1530s and into the 1540s worked with some of his native students at the Imperial College of the Holy Cross in Tlatelolco, just north of Mexico City, to compose a series of sermons for each Sunday in the church year and the festival of a number of important saints. These are completely in Nahuatl. Well, there's Latin, quotes from the Bible, obviously woven in there. But given how important this particular author and this manuscript being really one of the earliest surviving extensive collections of religious writing in Nahuatl, it seemed to me a really important and glaring hole in what
Mhm.
we currently have available to us as scholars. And so that on and we're a few years on here, and I'm actually just polishing up the final revisions before turning it over to the publisher at the end of the summer, and that will come out. And that's not going to be a monograph or a heavy work of analysis, really a critical translation where every single sermon is presented in transcription and translation with extensive notes. I have written an introductory study to precede it, which will help contextualize the manuscript and the sermons for interested readers. It's more kind of like a reference book that'll probably
Yeah.
be, spend a lot of time on the shelf in the library, perhaps. But it's a really important historical primary source, and it was really exciting to be a part of bringing that to the public. So been that's been a big thing. And then the last, exciting, I guess, sort of noteworthy project I've been involved in is actually I just got back from teaching a 2-week graduate summer workshop through Dumbarton Oaks and Princeton University to help a cohort of graduate students to become acquainted or better acquainted with these missionary writings in indigenous languages of Mesoamerica. And we spent some marvelous time hands-on with tremendous resources in both of those collections, looking at books and manuscripts from the 16th and 17th centuries. Really special experience of great students and great fellow instructors, and some really really amazing books and manuscripts. kind of doesn't get any better than that for me,
Yeah.
honestly.
And it sounds like you have a lot of work and projects going on. So kudos to you for being able to juggle
Things are
those.
busy.
Yes. And the
Yeah,
manuscript sort
yeah,
of,
it is a juggling match. Yeah.
yeah. I think I know you made a joke about it, maybe spending a lot of time in the library on the shelf, but I can imagine that would really be helpful for students. I know someone like I would definitely pick up the book and be like, oh, thank God I don't have to try and read the handwriting myself right now or something. Like I can kind of get introduced into this.
Yes, right, right.
So I that's really exciting and congratulations again.
Thank you.
And then I think for my next couple questions, you've spoken already a little bit about how your identity and your own heritage sort of informs your work and studies and how you navigate that. So I think moving to my next question, this is a little bit different. What, in your opinion, sort of distinguishes ethnohistory from standard history?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
if there even is a
Good question.
standard history, I
Well,
know it's a little confusing.
oh, sure. No, out there. But I like to think of ethnohistory as kind of if you imagine a Venn diagram that includes the field of history and the field of anthropology. That's in the kind of overlap between those two fields on some level. Ethnohistorians are also known historians. They could be known as historical anthropologists, but essentially, whereas a cultural anthropologist might study living indigenous peoples and cultures, an ethnohistorian would study historical indigenous peoples and cultures.
Mhm.
So from the past, as opposed to um, some of the theory and methodology of anthropology to do history, and in particular focusing on culture. So ethnohistory, and I should add that it's a very interdisciplinary field. So we could add to our Venn diagram. We could could add some other things as well. It's actually one of the things I really, really enjoy about it is that it is so interdisciplinary. And if you go to the annual meeting of the American Society for Ethnohistory, which is kind of the largest professional organization for ethnohistorians in the
Mhm.
US, you people from many different fields doing many different kinds of work. And it's a very rich, collaborative, interdisciplinary field of study. Uh, for my particular kind of ethnohistory, it's philological study of writings
Mhm.
that were done in indigenous languages in colonial times. So looking at this kind of documentary record through translation and analysis of indigenous language materials, the kind of work that people that I follow and interact with do.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for sort of explaining that a little bit. I think because there's so many different types of history and approaches you can have, it gets
Absolutely.
a
Yeah.
little blurry. I think a sort of follow-up question I had to that, and you explained it a little bit, talking about how it helps you, sort of use and interpret sources. Um, in what ways do you feel like the maybe anthropology approaches in ethnohistory have sort of contributed to your work or given you sort of different insight than other branches of history has?
Right. Well, so my PhD is in anthropology, in cultural anthropology.
Mhm.
My master's is in history, and I teach history. So I the line is pretty blurry between the
Mhm.
two for me. But I guess what I would say that my training in anthropology has shaped these sources because I'm primarily interested in what happens when cultures come in contact with each other. I'm interested in the kind of power dynamics that shape that contact. I'm interested in the way languages act and appropriate and borrow and change and mix and sort of transform each other in this kind of contact. I'm
Mhm.
specifically interested in the way religion um, changes, and so you kind of emphasis change in culture, transformation, how cultures change. That's, in my mind, the kind of anthropology that I'm bringing to the work that I do.
Mhm.
And there's some more kind of specific sorts of medical concepts that I incorporate into some of the work that I do. But that's in a nutshell how those two fields kind of come together in the work that I do.
Yeah. And I think that's just I think it's also sort of inspiring for people who maybe come from different, fields or want to merge together something like history and anthropology. I know at Northeastern we have like public history routes or world history routes. And so being
Sure,
able to sort of
sure.
mix these different branches together, I think realizing that it's a possibility, I think can be
Yeah,
really motivating for
yeah.
people who might want to get into the field.
It presents a difficulty because, as you know, academia is still so siloed, and the kind of disciplinary borders and boundaries, as I understand it, are still quite firm, and interdisciplinary work is not necessarily that easy to do. There are demands from each different discipline that work be done in a particular way or use particular sources or methods or theories. And one of the things I love about Northeastern is their long history of promoting world history field. I'm sure you know that world history wasn't always accepted as an academic discipline, but universities like Northeastern and others have really promoted it heavily. And so it might be at Northeastern there's more openness history.
Mhm.
I kind of think that unfortunately in today's the way academia is today, one has to kind of be an historian or an anthropologist,
Yeah.
and that can be tricky.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is something good to think about. And hopefully, can be challenged, I think, in the future because I think there's so much value in that sort of interdisciplinary. I know something I've run into is like you sort of have to label yourself as something, either you're an early Americanist or you're a colonial
Right,
historian or you something, and
right.
it's at some point the lines seem kind of arbitrary, ends up being
Totally.
connected.
Well, and it's especially true for me because I am a high school educator.
Right, right.
I'm not a professor at a college, so the people don't really necessarily know what to make of me.
Mhm,
And I will just here insert a little plug. Um, listening to this, you and may be in a particular stage of their career where they're still finishing their PhD and they haven't yet gotten their first job, that secondary education can be a tremendously rewarding and fruitful place to make one's is although we do not have research written into our job description, we do not have the same restrictions of discipline, of tenure, publishing or perishing kind of approach to things.
mhm,
All of my scholarship at my own pace,
mhm,
according to what projects I want to do. And, I have to make a lot of creative use of my summers and
mhm,
the other times where I have to work. And
mhm.
it definitely is quite a bit of a juggling match, but it's been a phenomenal career for me. And I think as the job market continues to look very complex and challenging for folks, that they ought not to overlook secondary education. I myself teach at a private secondary school, and private secondary schools are very much like small liberal arts colleges in many ways. Pretty heavy teaching load, and so one might have to navigate that anyway. But it's a really fantastic, for me it's been fantastic, although it does lead some people to kind of not be able to figure me out or know how to place me. So
Right.
as I publish more, and as I will, they get a sense of my um, ability to contribute to the conversation,
Yeah.
and hopefully this might make room for more independent scholars or secondary educators to do similar kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I do definitely feel like there's sort of a bias of if you aren't, going the traditional tenured professor track at
Sure,
like an Ivy, whatever,
sure.
then, you don't
Yeah,
know what you're
yeah.
talking about, or maybe you're not a real scholar, which is
Right,
so far from the truth.
right.
Um,
True.
so I think that's just a good discussion to have.
Yeah, yeah. It's important. It's shouldn't be overlooked potential career path.
Absolutely. And I think sort of transitioning into one of the last questions I had for you, how does cultural preservation factor into your work? Do NAGPRA or general repatriation efforts seem common in some of the work you've been doing? I know maybe from a historian angle, it might be less present, but maybe from an anthropology angle, it might be more.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
Sort of your input on that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, because I don't work with artifacts or human remains or things like that. I'm not sure NAGPRA would.
Mhm,
It doesn't really play a role in anything that
mhm,
I do. Um, I would say there is, the same processes and problems by which many artifacts came to occupy the collections in universities around the U.S. and Europe applies to how many of these cultural treasures in documentary form came to leave Mexico and parts of
mhm,
Mesoamerica as well. So you have some of the most precious treasures in the cultural heritage of, say, Mexico that are in the collections of England and the United States of America. And in some circumstances, these left in very unethical, or what we would consider to be unethical, ways today. And so, I haven't really heard a lot of talk about repatriation, but I know there have been efforts repatriate some of the most famous documents of sort of pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. For example, these spectacular and very rare painted codices that were sort of stolen away. after contact and are ranging from the Vatican to the National Library of France, let's say. I know that there have been efforts from Mexico to have those things returned, but so really to answer your question, it doesn't really factor all that
Hmm.
much.
Hmm.
You know, yeah, um, exist in a slightly different category, I
Hmm.
guess, in some ways than human remains would, for example.
Right.
And in many cases, the indigenous communities who produced these documents um, do not know about
Hmm.
them. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that is really a shame. And there are folks that are working towards bringing knowledge of these materials back to those indigenous communities. And I'm thinking in particular of the efforts of scholars like Kelly McDonough at University of Texas, Austin, or John Sullivan and Justina Wars, who have done work connecting communities with these documents that are so important. And I think that's incredibly laudable. And I myself would love to be a part of that.
Hmm.
I have really tried really hard, and I continue to try to look more about the identity of this indigenous person who copied these two plays into this
Hmm.
notebook of texts. It would be a dream of mine to be able to reconnect that community with this remarkable native intellectual who in this some really really interesting writing and but it's very difficult. That's a very difficult
Yeah. No,
challenge.
definitely. Not only I think just sort of tracing those connections, I think would be extremely difficult, but it would be
Yeah,
amazing
yeah.
if it was possible. Just something to add to
To
your
be able
already
to
massive
do
to-do
that.
list.
Oh, that one's always on my to-do list.
Yeah,
And hopefully someday I will be able to figure out who or where this person was from.
absolutely. And I believe that was the end of my sort of giant list of questions for you. I sort of wanted to give you the
Okay.
space
Okay.
to, if you had anything else you wanted to add or shout out or plug your own work or anything upcoming, you
I think
can
I've
feel
done
free to do
enough
that.
of plugging my own work. You've given me ample opportunities to do that. No, I think that pretty much covers it for me. I mean, I would just add, um, mentioned earlier, I really, for me, the interpersonal personal aspect of what I do is the most rewarding, and I love sharing my work.
Mhm.
And your listeners, if they're interested, if they want to contact me, I'm easily reachable at bleeming@gmail.com online, which lists all of my publications and the stuff I'm working on. And I'd be very interested in connecting with anyone who wanted to talk about Nahuatl or ethnohistory or any of the topics we've covered today.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. And yeah, I can definitely vouch for if anybody's listening and would like to contact Ben. He has been in contact with me for like a little over a year now, just from connection made on
Yes, yeah, for
HNet or
sure.
something, and super generous. So
Right.
thank you so much. And I will
You're
stop the
welcome.
recording now.